G'day, welcome back to Plugged In Australia Quick Charge, the shorter version of the show for when you want the main EV news without the full deep dive. This is episode 86 for Thursday, the 20th of August 2026. First episode for this week. It's been a bit of a quieter news week. Either that or I'm just getting a little bit more picky with the stories I choose to cover. Today, Mercedes-Benz finally puts an Australian price on the electric GLC. Zeekr turns up the power for our version of the 7GT. And Hyundai's Ioniq 3 has entered production with overseas pricing, suggesting Australia might finally get a Hyundai EV somewhere near the $40,000 mark. We've also got a much more substantial story around $400 million of heavy vehicle reforms and what they could mean for electric trucks. The plug-in hybrid C-Class is staying alive, and Victoria's electric fire truck has now completed more than 500 emergency calls. Without further ado, let's get into it. So we've covered the Mercedes-Benz GLC a few times on the podcast, so we already knew that it was on its way to Australia. It's on the Mercedes-Benz website and all that sort of bizzo, but what we didn't know was what it would actually cost, exactly what specifications we would receive, or precisely when it would arrive. And now we do. The GLC 400 4MATIC Electric will arrive in Australian showrooms in October, priced from $112,200 before on-road costs. But there's an unusual plot twist here. Mercedes is also offering a limited launch edition for $110,000 before on roads. So despite being called the launch edition, it's actually $2,200 cheaper than the regular GLC 400. And no, that isn't because Mercedes has stripped a heap of equipment out of it. The launch edition is essentially an introductory pricing exercise rather than a cut price specification. Underneath, the Australian GLC 400 uses two electric motors and an all-wheel drive producing 360 kilowatts and 800 newton meters, 0 to 100, 4.3 seconds. The usable battery capacity is 94.4 kilowatt hours with a claimed 630 kilometers of WLTP range. It also gets an 800 volt electrical system and can charge at up to 330 kilowatts DC. And under ideal conditions, Mercedes says around 300 kilometres of additional WLTP range can be added in about 10 minutes, with a 10 to 80% recharge taking about 22 minutes. Now, one specification I want to clarify is the AC charging. Now, some of the initial Australian launch reporting listed 22 kilowatt AC charging. However, Mercedes-Benz current Australian technical specification lists the maximum rate as 11 kilowatts. So, unless Mercedes subsequently updates that specification, 11 kilowatts is the figure that I'll be running with for the Australian car. There is plenty of equipment included as standard: 21-inch wheels, digital light headlights, a panoramic glass roof, a 10.3-inch digital instrument display, 14-inch central touchscreen, heads-up display, heated front seats, heated steering wheel. There's also a 128-litre frunk and a 570-litre boot. That expands to 1,740 litres with the rear seats folded. The buyers can spend another $5,200 on optional air suspension and rear-wheel steering, while $8,200 luxury package gets you things like ventilated and massaging front seats, heated rear seats, a Burmeister audio, and the additional passenger display. Now, that price puts it straight into the new BMW iX3's territory. The iX350 xDrive is $109,900 before on roads, so the regular GLC is slightly more expensive, while the Mercedes Launch Edition almost matches it. The BMW has a substantially higher claimed WLTP range, though, at more than 800 kilometres in its headline specification. So Mercedes isn't walking into an empty part of the market here. The important thing here is that it is no longer another future Mercedes EV with estimated specifications and unknown pricing. Orders are open, the Australian launch specification is locked in, and deliveries are due to begin in October. Staying with something we have covered previously, the Zeekr 7GT electric sports wagon was already part of Zeekr's 2027 Australian product plan, so I'm not going to run through the entire car again. The new information we have is what Australia is actually expected to get. Zeekr has now confirmed that the most powerful 7GT will produce 500 kilowatts. That's up from 475 kilowatts in the current European all-wheel drive version. Australia is also expected to receive a 3-variant range rather than the 7GT arriving purely as an expensive flagship performance model. Full local grade names, pricing and final specs still yet to be announced, but the international range gives us a reasonable idea of the structure. There's a smaller 75 kilowatt hour battery in the entry model, while higher variants will use a 100 kilowatt hour pack. The European rear-wheel drive long-range version produces 310 kilowatts and claims as much as 655 kilometres WLTP, while the current 475 kilowatt all-wheel drive version claims 558 kilometres. But those figures shouldn't automatically be applied to Australia. If our flagship genuinely has a different 500 kilowatt powertrain, its final Australian range and efficiency figures will need to be confirmed. Now, it could very easily just have the same range, that those motors may still have a little bit of extra power to give, and that's just been detuned for whatever reason in Europe, and we're just getting the full kitchen sink, as they like to say. But I guess we'll have to wait and find out about that one. The 7 GT uses an 800 volt electrical architecture, and the 100 kilowatt hour battery can theoretically accept charging at up to 450 kilowatts, with a claimed 10 to 80% recharge in about 15 minutes on a suitable charger. Timing also isn't completely locked in, although late 2026 or early 2027 remains the current expectation. So the genuinely new takeaway is pretty simple. We already knew the 7 GT was coming. Now we know Australia is getting a bit more of a hotter version of it, and Zeekr appears to be preparing a proper 3 model range rather than simply importing one expensive Halo wagon. And considering how few proper electric wagons Australia gets, I think that's much more interesting than another 500 kilowatt SUV. And Hyundai's small Ioniq 3 has now entered production in Turkey, which is a fairly important step because this is the Hyundai EVIE that could finally attack the affordable end of the Australian market. Production has started at Hyundai's Izmit factory following a roughly €250 million investment, with initial capacity of about 30,000 Ioniq 3s per year. Australian arrival is expected during the first half of 2027. The interesting development is some overseas pricing. The British range begins at £22,245,000 before current incentives and discounts, and that has led to Australian estimates suggesting the Ioniq 3 could potentially start somewhere around the 40 to 45 grand mark before on-road costs. I want to be very clear here though, Hyundai Australia has not announced a $40,000 price, and that figure's just an estimate based on overseas pricing and how Hyundai has historically positioned similar vehicles between different markets. So if Hyundai can get somewhere close to that, the Ioniq 3 becomes a much more significant vehicle for Australia. Now, there are 2 battery sizes. The entry car uses a 42.2 kilowatt hour battery, a front motor producing 108 kilowatts and 250 newton meters, and a projected WLTP range of approximately 344 kilometers. The long range gets a 61 kilowatt hour battery, about 100 kilowatts and 250 newton meters, and a projected 496 kilometers WLTP. This isn't another 800 volt Hyundai charging monster like the Ioniq 5. The Ioniq 3 uses 400 volt architecture. The smaller battery takes about 29 minutes to charge 10 to 80%, while the long range takes about 30. Standard AC charging is 11 kilowatts with 22 kilowatts available depending on specification. It's also quite practical for a small electric hatch. The car is about 4.15 metres long and will ride on a 2.68 metre wheelbase. Hyundai quotes 441 litres of total luggage space when its underfloor storage is included. Vehicle to load is available as well. This is also completely separate from the potential Ioniq 3N that I've discussed before. And that was the story about Hyundai N developing a more affordable performance EV. That was a little while ago now. This is the mainstream car that will actually compete on price with BYD, MG, Geely, Chery, and the growing number of Chinese brands attacking the bottom half of the market. Now, if Hyundai can land a long-range Ioniq 3 with nearly 500 kilometres of WLTP, somewhere in the mid-40s, could become a bit interesting. But until Hyundai Australia publishes a price list, 40 grand is a possibility, not a promise, unfortunately. Now to what I think is probably the most important or interesting story for today. The federal government and the states and territories have backed a new heavy vehicle productivity reform package, with $400 million being made available through the National Productivity Fund. And there's an important distinction here. Now, this is not a $400 million electric truck subsidy. The government isn't simply just getting the checkbook out and cutting a check for $400 million for businesses to buy battery electric prime movers. The money is conditional funding for states and territories to implement a broader set of heavy vehicle reforms. However, several of those reforms directly target problems that have been holding electric trucks back. One is mass and road access rules. Now, electric trucks are generally heavier than equivalent diesel vehicles because of their batteries. Now, if the legal weight limit stays exactly the same, that extra vehicle weight can come straight out of the available payload. And for a freight operator, less payload can completely destroy the business case. There's not much point saving money on fuel if you need to put more trucks on the road to move the same amount of freight. The reforms are intended to improve access for higher productivity and zero emissions heavy vehicles and make road approvals more consistent rather than forcing operators through a patchwork of different rules. Charging is another part of it. Australia needs planning and road infrastructure that actually allows large truck charging sites to be built where freight vehicles travel and stop. Now, B-double just can't simply pull into the average suburban public charger. You need turning room, you need suitable parking, extremely high electrical capacity, and ideally charging that can happen during mandatory driver rest breaks without forcing a truck to detach its trailer. And every time I mention that, I mention how much truck drivers love unhooking trailers. Then there are delivery curfews. A battery electric truck is dramatically quieter at low speed than a large diesel, yet in many areas it can still be caught by restrictions originally designed around noisy conventional trucks. And that's not so much accelerating, it's a bit more about decelerating. Anybody who's heard those big Jacobs brakes, make quite a bit of a noise. I'm not going to make the noise because that'll be embarrassing, but you know what I'm talking about. The reform package specifically looks at exemptions and changes for quieter zero emissions vehicles. And this links directly into Australia's fuel security problem. Australia remains enormously dependent on imported diesel. The current diesel stock equates to roughly 36 days of consumption. And recent modelling, looking at what electrification could do to those reserves, estimated that electrifying diesel, like commercial vehicles, could stretch that to about 44 days. And you add rigid trucks, that'll push it about to around 50. Rigid truck just means a truck on its own with no trailer. Electrifying the entire road freight fleet, including articulated trucks, could theoretically take it to about 63 days. Now, those are modelling exercises done on computers. They're not forecasts, and nobody's suggesting Australia can replace every diesel prime mover next year, that's for sure. Long-distance electric freight remains very expensive and very infrastructure intensive. Electric prime movers can still cost 2 or 3 times as much upfront as diesel equivalents, and regional charging remains a huge challenge. However, metropolitan and back-to-base freight is a completely different kettle of fish. A truck running predictable routes every day and returning to the same depot every night is one of the easier commercial vehicles to electrify, provided the operator can legally carry enough payload and can actually get enough electrical capacity into the depot. So I think this is definitely moving in the right direction. Subsidising an electric truck while leaving it stuck with the wrong mass limits, inconsistent road access, nowhere sensible to charge, and a delivery curfew written around diesel engine noise doesn't really solve the underlying problem. Removing those barriers might be less exciting than announcing another rebate, but it would ultimately do more to make electric freight commercially viable. And another Mercedes-Benz story, they've all firmed up plans for the facelifted C-Class in Australia. And importantly for us here on Plugged In Australia, the plug-in hybrid isn't disappearing when the dedicated electric C-Class arrives. The updated conventional C-Class is due here in the first half of 2027, with both mild hybrid petrol and plug-in hybrid powertrains planned. And we've already covered the completely separate electric C-Class, which is being built on a dedicated electric architecture. Mercedes therefore intends to sell both approaches alongside each other. What hasn't been confirmed yet is the exact Australian PHEV badge. Now, there has been overseas reporting around the C400E 4MATIC, but Mercedes-Benz Australia hasn't yet locked that name or the complete local specifications. The headline overseas system produces up to 290 kilowatts and 650 newton meters using a 19.53 kilowatt hour usable battery. Electric range is about 100 kilometers WLTP depending on the spec. It can charge at 11 kilowatts AC and unusually for a PHEV up to 55 kilowatts DC. The DC capability could make the car much more practical for people who genuinely intend to use the electric side of the powertrain rather than treating the battery as something that gets charged twice a year. For now, though, treat those as the relevant overseas specs rather than a locked-in Australian C400E specification. What is confirmed locally is the bigger strategic point. Mercedes isn't asking every C-Class buyer to jump directly from petrol to a full EV. The plug-in hybrid will continue alongside the dedicated electric C-Class, giving buyers two very different ways of electrifying essentially the same part of the Mercedes range. And finally, something a little different. Victoria's first electric fire truck, known as EVIE, has now responded to more than 500 incidents. And the results from the trial are a little bit interesting, I think. EVIE is a heavily customised Rosenbauer RT built for Fire Rescue Victoria. Across more than 4,700 kilometres of emergency operation, researchers were able to directly compare more than 400 of its responses with conventional appliances. EVIE reached incidents faster than 72% of those matched responses. The average travel time saving was 26 seconds, or about 11%. And once crews arrived, the truck's design also reduced the time required to actually start doing the job. Across fire suppression incidents, crews were starting their intervention around 45 seconds sooner overall. For emergency medical responses, the improvement was around 33 seconds. Now, I wouldn't turn that into a headline saying electric motors automatically made the fire truck 45 seconds faster. A lot of the improvement comes from the design of the entire vehicle as well. EVIE has a low entry cab, much tighter turning circle, it's got all-wheel steering, improved equipment access, automatic systems, and a completely different layout from a conventional truck it was compared to. It has a 12.5 metre turning circle compared to about 17.6 metres for the conventional appliance used in the study. There were also individual tasks where the conventional truck was quicker. Ladder deployment and suction hose setup were slower on EVIE during controlled testing, so this wasn't a clean sweep in every category. The powertrain is interesting as well. EVIE carries two 66 kilowatt-hour batteries, giving 132 kilowatt-hours total, with separate electric motors for the front axle, rear axle, and the pump for the hose. It can charge at up to 22 kilowatts AC or 150 kilowatts DC, with the DC charge to 80% taking about 45 minutes. But there's another important caveat. The quoted 500 kilometre combined operating range is not 500 kilometres of battery-only range. The truck also has a 125-litre diesel-powered energy backup unit. That engine can recharge the battery and provide backup energy during extended operations. Under Australian vehicle regulations, EVIE is still classified as a battery electric vehicle because the wheels are propelled exclusively by the electric motors. The diesel engine does not directly drive the truck. It's an EREV. So it isn't a pure battery fire truck the way most people would assume from the headline, but the backup system also really does make sense for an emergency vehicle. You can't have a fire truck simply stop operating because the battery percentage is getting uncomfortable halfway through a major industrial fire. And after more than 500 real emergency responses, rather than a few demonstration laps, Fire Rescue Victoria now says EVIE is ready for operational use across metropolitan Melbourne. The one interesting thing I couldn't find out was how much that diesel motor kicked in. That spec wasn't, not that I could find anyway, so that'll be something interesting to know as well. So definitely one of the more useful electric vehicle trials that I've seen at the moment. It isn't trying to prove that every diesel fire truck needs to disappear tomorrow. It's putting the technology into real emergency service, measuring what actually gets better, finding the things that don't, and working out whether electrification can improve the job rather than simply reduce emissions. And that is a wrap for episode 86 of Plugged In Australia Quick Charge. Bit of a varied one today, everything from your luxury electric SUVs, you've got affordable Hyundai EVs, you've got freight regulation, and even an electric fire truck proving itself in emergency service. So, as always, thank you so much for listening. I hope you got something out of today's episode there. Any feedback, info@pluggedinaustralia.com.au. And until the next time, stay plugged in and stay charged. Ci vediamo.